Oh boy, this might rustle some jimmies. Hello everyone, Maoism here with a brand new video, and today's topic is on the accusation of Maoism being dogmatic. Now, what brought this up? Well, after arguing with two dumbasses on Discord who were supposed to be Marxist on how Maoism is somehow dogmatic, I decided to make a video about going over as to why it is not. Now, this video will have 4 parts. Part 1 will discuss as to why non-Marxist-Leninist Maoists say it is dogmatic. Part 2 will be an argument for how it is not. Part 3 will discuss on how a science is unable to be dogmatic. And Part 4 is on how to deal with these accusations. So, let us begin. Okay, so why are we as Maoists so often called dogmatic? Is there any basis within this? Well, materially, no, but ideally, yes. In the material reality, Maoists do understand dialectical materialism, but the argument of us being dogmatic usually comes from MLs that are stagnant in their ideology. How are they stagnant? Well, most MLs today tend to uphold revisionist lines and revisionist leaders for the misinterpretation of anti-imperialism. As I've discussed earlier in my video on two-line struggle and revisionism, most of the MLs will usually be dingas. However, I'll expand upon it and make it into 3 categories. Category 1 would be the Brezhnevites. These people tend to support Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, but oppose Khrushchev and other modern revisionist states such as Vietnam and China. But they uphold Brezhnev as the man that at least tried to restore the USSR to socialism and even support the Eastern Bloc revisionist leaders and Soviet imperial puppets such as the Derg in Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Cuba, the DPRK, and so on. They mainly do this due to being caught up with either the aesthetics or not having proper understanding of Marxism. For the former are probably either clout chasers or teenagers still learning, but sadly when they see red, they think it's automatically socialist, or when they see the word socialist, they assume that it is so. The latter, on the other hand, are at least somewhat learned people, but don't understand the material basis of the universality of, say, things such as People's War, the Cultural Revolution, or New Democracy. They themselves are still learning, are stuck in a mindset that with the previous quote-unquote successes with the other red countries, that they are not needed. This, within itself, is ironically a dogmatic view, yet they call us dogmatists due to this absurd notion of us not analyzing the material conditions, without any sufficient proof to back it up that we haven't. But when they themselves haven't done so either, they will still make claims on baseless accounts that these ideas have either been used before, or that since it is not applicable everywhere, it is not universal. I'll discuss more on that later. The second category are the revisionists known as the dingus. Now, whether they support Khrushchev or not doesn't matter, as they mainly uphold people such as Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping, in an undialectical view that China had to go back to capitalism despite the fact they had already gone through the stage and advanced their country, then moving to socialism, but having to go back to capitalism under the revised principle of GDP, despite the fact that life in China was already stable, better than capitalist countries, and was much closer to communism than other so-called socialist countries at the time. They tend to attack us due to us not understanding to what I assume is their so-called fluid view of reality and politics, when in reality they are just revising the scientific principles of Marxism and taking steps back. This isn't an advancement of Marxism, but an error based on metaphysical thinking. This whole idea that GDP equates to better living standards is utter nonsense. What we have seen now in China is severe alienation, a fascist-like party that cracks down on any leftist critique, a rising imperialist power in Western countries taking advantage of this by having their companies overseas in China. Now, they themselves might not be dogmatists, but they are revisionists, and they should be critiqued for the erroneous line that they hold. Specifically, the stage of going backwards. When you reach a new stage in human development, you do not take a step back. Taking a step back from socialism to capitalism is a revisionist move. The third category is that they are a combination of the two. I have seen on some occasions of these people that are pro-Brezhnev or even pro-Khrushchev and are pro-Deng. They are pro both post-Stalin Eastern Bloc and Deng Xiaoping, along with revisionist states such as Vietnam, Laos, the DPRK, and Cuba. Why? Well, as I said before, the other heartbreak of their not existing socialist countries today is too great that they have to make their own. So that any country that has social progression, nationalization, or a policy that socialism would also have will make them latch onto it. They would even latch on to non-Marxist socialism, which in that case it isn't really socialism, it's just capitalism, such as Nazarism, Baathism, Juche, and the People's Yamahiriya, just because they have socialist in their name. They don't realize that this is no different than when conservatives try to say that Nazis were socialists solely for the fact that they had the word socialist in the party's name. Hell, I would even go further with this hot take. The only reason that these leftists are not part of Nazism or have any sympathies to Nazism or even consider themselves Nazis was not because of the Holocaust or the racism. If that were the case, they would call out China and the chauvinism that exists within Vietnam and other past Eastern Bloc countries, not because they targeted communists for their oppression or even killing some of them. If this were the case, they would call out Assad, Nasser, Gaddafi, Saddam, and Iran, but because they launched a war on what was, at the time, the most powerful, openly pro-communist country that had existed, the Soviet Union. Not to mention they have promoted so many anti-communist propaganda, from the so-called Holodomor genocide to the whole cultural Bolshevism bullshit. Not to mention, the Soviet Union, post-Stalin, even outright supported these non-Marxist cliques under the guise of anti-imperialism, by doing trade with them, making them rely on the USSR. Khrushchev did this with Cuba and Egypt, not to mention the revolutionaries wouldn't have needed to support said reactionary leaders when they should have been funding communist orgs to overthrow them, but in reality, they did not care. Just because the USSR post-Stalin supported these people doesn't mean that it was good. This isn't a dogmatic statement. This is based on materialist analysis. Yes, Marxists should support the national bourgeois against the comprador bourgeois, but afterwards, they should support the proletariat of the said country. That is the next logical step within Marxism. On the other hand, it is dogmatic to only stick with those so-called revolutionaries, or the national bourgeois, and not support the overthrow of them. It is not dogmatic to call out revisionism within countries that claim to be red, and to deny that they are socialist. Remember, ruthless critique of all that exists. This includes revisionist countries such as the DPRK, Cuba, China, and so on. It is instead dogmatic to claim that these countries are socialist without critiquing them and having no analysis. So here I have showed you why they call us dogmatist. But how is Maoism not dogmatic? Well, for one, Maoism is based on the scientific principle of dialectical materialism. We view that the material world is primary and that what causes it to exist is via dialectics, as things are constantly changing due to the contradictory nature of each other, thus making new outcomes based on that contradiction. We understand that life is thus then constantly evolving and not static, for if it was static, we would all be dead. We base our understanding of the world and politics on this scientific principle. So, is that why they call us dogmatic? No, unless they are postmodernist. We understand Marx's and Engels' contribution to communism and its synthesization by other contributors such as Lenin, whom in turn guarded from reformists and liberals such as Bernstein, Kautsky, and even Rosa. He helped show us that why violent revolution is needed, guarded against Marxism being turned into a form of liberalism, and why the vanguard along with the dictatorship of the proletariat was needed to guard against the bourgeois. Later, the same contribution would be made by Stalin, a man that formulated Marxism-Leninism in the beginning stage. He helped guard against the dogmatist Trotsky that thought imperialism would somehow help bring the world revolution, instead of understanding that socialism in one country was the most logical conclusion on guarding the people's nation. Later, Mao would bring Leninism to its highest stage through his form of protracted people's war, theory and practice method, and even introducing his thought and developed Marxism scientifically, philosophically, and economically. Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought was the highest stage of Marxism for a long time, until the early 1980s, when the Peruvian Communist Party synthesized Mao Zedong thought, and making it universal through the analysis of practice, thus making ideas such as protracted people's war, new democracy, mass line, and cultural revolution universal. This in turn is now known as the synthesization of Maoism. The highest form of Maoism as of now is Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, Gonzalo thought, to which Gonzalo has formulated his theory based on the Peruvian struggle. Today, Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, also known as MLM-PM, the PM meaning principally Maoism by the way, is seen as the highest stage of Marxism as it applies to both theory and practice, thus making it a scientific practice rather than a metaphysical and idealist one, as there are Maoists practicing the revolution today. The challenges of it being dogmatic simply comes from the fact that many people don't understand new democracy or protracted people's war. One person that I was talking to a couple days ago made an argument that PPW was only used for the Chinese and that Mao said it was only for China and that my basis of it being universal was dogmatic, failing to see what he had said himself was dogmatic, holding what Mao said as rule of law rather than delving deeper or to think that Mao was wrong. He also called various PPW or Protected People's War as insurrections, which is beyond stupid, as they had vanguards and educated people leading them based on the principles of Maoism. Of course, the next stupid argument is the countryside and peasantry, which is a simplistic way of looking at things. You don't need the peasantry, you need the people. It is the people's army and not the peasants' army. Next is New Democracy. Many people say it is similar to the NEP, and I see why, as I have explained in my previous video responding to Zoomer. The NEP was used for transitioning from feudal society to a capitalist society. New Democracy is that process given its proper name based on the stages of human development to build the nation. Hell, I would even argue all forms of civilization has used a form of New Democracy in one way or the other. Because all civilizations had to transfer out of a feudal reign or semi-colonial reign. It just wasn't a Marxist one until Mao analyzed the world, the material conditions in China, that New Democracy was formalized. Even for colonized nations such as New Africa, First Nationers, Sami, Romani, and so on, in order to build their own nation, to have their own autonomy, they need New Democracy in order to get to socialism. Since all nations in existence had to go through this period, this makes it universal based on analysis on history of class struggle. Many people think New Democracy is universal because many modern nations don't need to use it, but they misunderstand that each nation had to transfer to capital based on new democratic principles, but at that time it just didn't have a name. And plus, again, the capitalists were around, even when communism existed, the scientific principle of communism didn't come around until the 1800s. And then, again, as I said before, New Democracy in the Marxist sense didn't even exist until Mao formulated it. So, long story short, the idea of calling it dogmatic, despite the fact that it's based on historical and a material analysis, is complete and utter rubbish. Lastly, we are called dogmatic for being critical of revisionist and not buying into Fujimori propaganda. We are hated, mainly by MLs and anarchists, due to the fact that we oppose revisionist countries, theories, and people. Alright, so this has made us quite unpopular, as I already explained as to why that is. This shouldn't really bother us, because Maoists are the ones today carrying out revolution in countries such as Turkey, Philippines, Nepal, India, Peru, and I think even in Bangladesh. Not to mention the most active orgs doing actual revolutionary work and opposing electoralism, such as the CR, CPUSA, the Maoists in Canada, France, and England. Yes, compared to the revisionist party, it might not be much, but in terms of practice, we are the ones constantly engaging in practice and not just theory. Lastly is, of course, that our basis for Maoism and our principles come from the PCP. There has been years of propaganda about the PCP killing natives, bombing businesses, and killing just for the sake of killing. This is nothing new. It's nothing more than anti-communist propaganda from the fascist Fujimori government that opposed them at that time. This is, again, nothing new in general to communists, as we had the same lies pushed about Stalin by the Nazis that many people today accept without question. And the same is true here with the PCP, with the only exception is that most leftists are more accepting of this due to it fitting their narrative. They'll use stats by the fascist government, as anti-communists also use stats from the Nazi government about the famine of the USSR and China. Now, were there bombing of businesses and killing of workers? Yes, mainly by the MRTA, a Marxist-Leninist group that had a horrible line. The PCP did get into fights with them, but it was necessary as the MRTA were harming the proletariat. Was there killing of innocents? Yes, but from all sides. MRTA, Fujimori, and even the PCP. Often the tragedy they love to cite is, oh god, I cannot pronounce this, Luca Namarasta. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced that. A small town or village where a fascist militia held power, and surprise, surprise, there was a war between the two after a PGA member was murdered by the fascists, and what resulted was a bloody firefight. Yes, 69 people died, and some of those were innocents, but they did not target innocent people. Despite whatever evidence I give, the revisionists and dogmatists will deny this, such as how the anarchists deny the Nazi lie of the Holodomor. But that is the price of being a communist. Heaps of rubbish will be piled onto you, and the winds of history will blow them away and absolve us, but for now, this is something we have to fight against. Plus, again, it's a revolution. Revolution is war. People are going to die, whether guilty or innocent. It's the sad fact of life. It can't be avoided. It happened in the American Revolution. It happened in the English Revolution. It happened in revolutions everywhere. It's just something that's asinine to me. Now, Marxism is a science based on the objective reality of dialectical materialism, as I've already discussed. But there are philosophers out there that make the argument that Marxism, and science in general, as being dogmatic. Now, usually these form of arguments are postmodern arguments, and its basis for them for being dogmatic is the fact that when science says something is correct, it is objectively correct. So, from here we can see that why they argue that science is dogmatic due to it being contradictory to subjective views. The issue with this is that it is a liberal narrative that hinders philosophy and science. When we reject the universal, we reject the reality we live in. We live in a world of constant contradictions. Dialectics and the material conditions are the primary substances of which we know by our senses. And even if something that exists outside of our senses, it is material. Because for something to exist, it has to have atomic particles for it to exist. The particles themselves are materialistic, and for it to manifest into existence, whether we know it or not, is caused by a dialectic of two forces creating a synthesis of that contradiction. Whatever we think of that could happen, with no proof or universal agreed upon logic, is simply idealistic, which is the natural reactionary tendency of trying to understand a certain thing. In reality, things that we know now and what we don't know have always existed before we got here, when we got here, and even if our species go extinct, they'll continue to exist after us. Now, is this dogmatic? Perhaps. But does this make science dogmatic? No, not really. You see, in science, there's a thing called falsifiability, which allows for it to be a possibility for it to be wrong, thus giving it a chance to change over time. For instance, Marxism by itself is a scientific understanding of the world and class struggle, but without practice. That is until Lenin and Rosa put it in practice. From these two experiments, we saw one success and one error, but one managed to show it worked over the other. Lenin's theory proven correct and Rosa's theory proven false. The scientific practice of Leninism was then expanded upon by Stalin and later Mao to help to fit the material conditions of our understanding of the natural world growing. With Maoism being the recent stage of development, if the science, or science in general, was dogmatic, it wouldn't be as flexible as we see it now. For it to be dogmatic, it has to be static, like religion, that argues that there is truth no matter what, even what is contradicted. When science is contradicted, it does not take the same line as religion, but will either A, expand upon the theory, or B, be discarded. So, we can clearly see that science and all that falls under it is unable to be dogmatic. So, we can see from this that we can only conclude that Maoism, since this is part of Marxism, which is based on dialectical materialism, which is a science, is not a dogmatic theory, thus making the dissenters' argument of being dogmatic unsound and complete nonsense. So, how do we deal with these accusations? Depending on the person, we can either ignore them, teach them, or struggle with them. The ones that want to learn about Maoism, we should teach as to why it is not dogmatic. To those that aren't sure of Maoism but are open to debate about it, we should struggle with. And for those that have no interest with the Maoism and dig their heels into the ground, we should ignore them. They will just waste our time. Listen, there will be people that shit on us. This is nothing new. People have always been shitting on communists since the dawn of fucking time. This shouldn't deter us, but instead give us reason to act. When we carry out our theory, we are proving that the theory works. It is indeed not dogmatic. We shouldn't worry about the quote-unquote comrades say that it is. Holy shit, that video was long. Oh god, fuck. Okay, well, that was my video on Maoism not being dogmatist, and I hope you learned something new. If you have any questions or critiques, leave them in the comment section down below. Like the video if you liked it, dislike if you dislike it. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell notification. This is Maoist98 signing off and being prepared to process this long-ass video.